And good afternoon. So welcome to the second of the summer 2020 Digital Classicist London seminars. This week we're extremely pleased to have Dr. William Garood with us, who's going to talk to us about latent prosopography and Socrates Scholasticus Ecclesiastical history. Will finished his PhD at King's College London a couple of years ago. And is currently an independent scholar, but still working on and thinking about aspects of digital methods in prosopography, in ancient and late antique prosopography. So we'll hear more about that. As always, if anybody watching live, please feel free to ask questions by leaving a comment on the YouTube live chat box, and we'll keep an eye on that, and we'll try and address those questions at the end. I'll hand over to you, Will.
Thanks, Gabby, and thanks everyone for having me. I'm very impressed we've been able to get these to work. The last 3 months of other work conference calls has made me a tiny bit nervous, and I'm also doubly nervous today because although you haven't had prosopography for a while, I think at these seminars, you've got 2 sessions during this run. John Bradley, in a couple of weeks' time, is going to talk about his prosopographical project, and as he co-supervise this thesis, everything I say should be taken with the caveat that John may contradict it, and you should defer to him. But I want to, as Gabby says, just do a recap of some of the key elements that I've been thinking about and worked on through my PhD around late antique prosopography. And I want to do just probably 2 or 3 things during this talk. So one, to give a bit of background to late antique prosopography itself. Introduce as well sort of the state of general digital prosopographies, particularly those done at King's, which I've obviously built on for my work, and then showcase where I think they can be evolved, and particularly what that means for Socrates Scholasticus and indeed sort of more generally around prosopography. So Gabby, I'm going to switch to the slides now. If I can get this right. So I wanted to start. Are they live? So I want to start with a bit of definitions. I'm conscious that prosopography, of all areas, classicists are better on prosopography than anyone else. But it's worth just working out what we mean, or certainly what I mean when I come to talk about this. So this is my broad definition of prosopography around the structuring of biographical information. And the structuring here is the important word, and this is why it so neatly fits, I think, with digital humanities generally and digital classics for this conversation. So there's lots of work that dances around this, but really interesting prosopography puts firm structures around things, around groups of individuals, concrete individuals that we can talk about. And you'll often see this, I think, in 2 broad senses. At the bottom there, there's a reference prosopographies, and that's in blue because that's what we're going to talk about today. Real compilations around sets of persons, and depending on your period, as a historian, you'll be familiar with those. For non-historians, those are big reference works that compile information around a set of people, highly structured. They're not designed with a particular use in mind, in theory at least. And I would stress that defined by approach rather than by scale. So there are some very big projects around, which we'll talk about in a bit, at various stages of the Roman Empire and before, and a bit less often in other contexts. But it's the approach, not the scale, that defines them. Most other people sort of encounter these in the analyses in the work that people do with prosopography, either drawing generalized conclusions or establishing links between individuals. There's a string of these. The most famous, I think, is probably Ronald Syme's work on the Augustan regime and the links between those individuals. I want to talk about reference prosopography around, as I say, late antiquity and Socrates Scholasticus. That's the work I'm doing. But I want to take us back to the beginning of where this all starts, which is Imperial Roman prosopography, and this chap who is Theodore Mommsen, the founder, really of sort of modern prosopography. And I want to dwell on this for a little bit, just because when we talk about prosopography, and particularly late antique prosopography, it's very much in the shadow of the work he started in the late 19th century to cope with the large numbers of inscriptions and other epigraphic material that was being published at the time. So he instigated a project with others in Berlin to look at the information they had in inscriptions around the secular careers, really, of Roman officials. So, and that's what's published in the late 1890s. And that really defined, I think, how we thought about prosopography for a long time. So very clear boundaries. The Roman Empire for the first 3 centuries, obviously fairly stable in terms of geography. There's a handful of discussions over who's in and who's out, about some barbarians make it, like Zenobia, and some don't, like Arminius, but broadly not a particularly contentious debate. And also not very contentious about what to put in. So working off the epigraphic material, this is lots of career inscriptions of senior officials, senators, or senior members of the equestrian order only in the epigraphy. If you got in a literary source, you got in, except if your only attestation was the Bible, in which case you were excluded. And it was ruthlessly specific about those dates. So if you started your career before the cutoff point in 284, at the accession of Diocletian, they counted only the bits that you'd done and not the things that came after. And for a long time, that was the dominant model of how we thought about prosopographies. You'll see on the next slide, I've got a lot of pictures of books. This was in 3 volumes initially, organized by alphabetical order, and really listing out all those individuals. A Greek one followed pretty soon afterwards. And for a very long time, prosopography was considered, a Roman or classical province. And so throughout the 20th century, you see a whole sequence of sort of Roman and Byzantine, I suppose I should say, prosopographies that really pretty much covered the next sort of 1200 years of persons. So they took a while to do it. And there's much less for other countries, though that's changing eventually. I should say, after the PIR, that imperial prosopography, the first project that really got off the ground was to start it again and to look at it in a bit more detail, expand those criteria. The other project that started at the same time was around late antiquity, and to do very much what the team in Berlin had done for the early imperial period, and look at the secular elites. And that project had various false starts, interrupted by at least one war, but which eventually came to fruition as the prosopography of the later Roman Empire, starting publishing in the 70s through to the 90s. And then you get this flurry of parallel projects looking at other parts of Roman history. The Paleologan period at the end, on roughly the same timetable. The middle Byzantine period in Germany. These are all books, obviously, that looks at the sort of 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. The team in London and the team in Germany are doing the same time period. They discovered this partway through the project, but by the time the team in London were complete, we've moved to a CD. So this is the prosopography of the Byzantine Empire. Then they divvied up the intervening periods. So the prosopography of the Byzantine World, probably the most significant shift in approach, and I'll talk about that in a bit, looking at the 11th century. Gaps filled in here around the 9th to the 11th century. And then sort of bringing up the rear almost is the Christian prosopography of late antiquity. And I put sort of approximate dates on this one, because although it starts first published in the 80s, it's been ongoing for decades. And after that, a lone publication on Africa in 1982, there was nothing for another 2 decades. And that really sums up where late antiquity is in terms of its prosopography. So it has both it's probably the most recent set of publications, and the very latest of that PCBE series have come out in the last few years. Though there are still several that are done by region, several ones that are not published, and then the earliest of these later prosopographies, the PLRE. from the 70s. And this means that pretty much it's uniquely badly served amongst all of these periods. So although most of these are published in book form, they're mostly available digitally in some form. So is the second edition of the PIR. That's not true of any of the late antique work. Though work is underway to try and address that. There's still huge gaps. The secular prosopography is fuzzy in its definition, so it's published in 3 volumes, and the geographical and social characteristics of who's in vary materially between volumes, partly because of the shifting geographical scope of the empire. And because it took so long for the ecclesiastical material to start being published, you get quite a lot of bleed across in terms of information. So bishops crop up in the PLRE in some context, including slightly curiously, the only mention of Augustine is not in the Christian prosopography of Africa, but in the elements of his secular career in the corresponding volume of the PLRE. As I said, the PCB has only really done a handful of provinces, only one in the east, the province of Asia, came out about 10 years ago, and certainly incomplete for the west. They're the big ones. Province of Spain have been done. Nothing's digital, and there are huge gaps. So that's sort of where my work started. But it's worth noting how this contrasts really with where others are. So the prosopography, as I mentioned, sort of taken to digital, like the proverbial duck to water. Highly structured data is a natural fit, and that was recognised before the computing technology had really caught up. In the last couple of decades, you see a series of big prosopographical projects that are both Byzantine and others. These are some key ones coming out of King's. There's the prosopography of the Byzantine World, and then constantly updating, both in functionality and in extent, Anglo-Saxon England, and the people of medieval Scotland. We'll come back to particularly as I think it has the latest update and some thinking on some key areas. And they all are sort of obviously digital, very interesting in terms of access, but also factoid prosopographies, which we'll come on to a particular way of approaching this that tries to do this in a different way to how they've traditionally been done. I'll pause here just to talk about where Socrates Scholasticus fits into late antique, the world, and prosopography. So we're in the 4th and 5th centuries here. Socrates Scholasticus wrote in the 2nd quarter of the 5th century. He's one of the major ecclesiastical historians of that period. It's a flourishing of ecclesiastical history. Then, for various reasons, he's writing about the 4th and early 5th century. He's continuing the work of Eusebius of Caesarea, the great chronicler of the sort of pre-Christian Christianity in the pre-Christian empire, and of Constantine the Great. It's a fairly hefty source. It's about 500 pages of Greek, and that translates to a lot of material in general, but certainly for prosopography. And is a key source for those doctrinal battles of the 4th century. Not the only source by any means, but these ecclesiastical historians together in Socrates is the earliest of those, and certainly the best dated as a key source for doing that. And he's fairly underrepresented in the prosopographies of the period, as I say, simply because of the gaps that we're talking about. Little on the Christian prosopography on the east, and in the secular prosopography, they've not made as much use of the ecclesiastical material generally as they might, and of course they're not officially looking at churchmen. So what I've done is to build a reference prosopography of Socrates Scholasticus Ecclesiastical history of a single source. I've developed it using the factoid model that we'll talk about in a sec, to test and refine that model, and add and make some suggested changes that I think will be useful, particularly around collation and analysis. And I would hope that this forms as a building block for our contribution to those gaps in late antique prosopography. This is squarely in the areas that we have got less coverage of as a company. So I've mentioned the factoid model a few times, and this is the bit I'm most nervous about, because I'm not sure whether this will be hugely familiar to everyone, because I'm sure in previous sessions we'll have gone through this, or whether this is entirely new. So for those of you who have heard this before, forgive me, and for those of you who this is new, forgive me too if I skate over this. So I've just put side by side an illustration of this, what the PLRE did in 1980, it's the second of the 3 volumes, and what the Prosopography of the Byzantine World does. This is their 2nd edition. But stepping back, the underlying rationale for this is that the factoid model tries to move away from a sort of authored article around an individual. Someone's read all the sources and summarized what they know around, in this case, Arcadius, and his in his career as prefect, possibly twice over, Arcadius 5 and Arcadius 6, maybe the same person. And instead say, well, what are the pieces of information that we know, and to whom can we tie those pieces of information? So on the left is how PLRE does it. Writes an article about Arcadius. It's in a structured order. His sort of offices first, other key mentions, events that he was related to, seeking asylum, and then a string of sources. As it happens, this has got some ambiguous identification in, but if it didn't, it would still look exactly the same. And then on the right, that Prosopography of the Byzantine World introduces the factoids. So there are different kinds of factoid. There's more here. This goes on for longer. There are narratives, there are descriptions, there are offices, and the like, and they're linked to one or more individuals. So when you look up a particular individual, they have their name as you expect, and then all the scraps of information associated with him. And there's no particular order to these. The events that he's associated with, some of which will obviously include plenty of other people. And then in this case, you can see a series of descriptions and the relevant Greek for each of those. And this has sort of huge advantages for how we think about prosopography, how we think about the information we've got. It's much closer to the source, so you have much less editorializing and summarizing. It's much easier to indicate ambiguity, though I don't think we've cracked that quite in prosopography. But it's certainly easier to attest different events, different interpretations rather, or different source material about it. If you have hostile and positive accounts of the same person, they'll both they will both appear, and scholars can make their own judgment, and they are hugely easier to search. So both the PIR and the PLRE have promised final volumes that never materialized. There were going to be lots of corrections of errors, but also tables of concordances, lists of office holders, etc. None of that, that's all baked in to the factoid model to be able to look up people around at a certain time, look up those with particular descriptions, and then when you get to offices, look up those who hold offices or hold particular views, depending on what's captured in the database. And in late antique prosopography, we're a long way away from this model on the right. And there's a reason for that. It's very labor intensive, and pulling it together is a major task. But even the most recent French volumes on the Christian prosopography are in the original book form. They look very much like the things on the left, though they're very, very, very much longer. So what I used to build a very simple prosopography of Socrates, and I won't dwell on these. These are my data tables that I've used to do those. The important advantage I have is that it's a single source, which means I can be much simpler. So there's relatively small amounts of data. It's got a specific structure. The pain of all these large projects is trying to push different kinds of text through the same narrow funnel. So to talk about epigraphy in the same way to talk about narrative sources, and they need different structures. I don't have that, and I can act as a centralizing function around these, so that I can put consistency around types and elements of those. I'm not going to dwell. There's a whole raft of sort of choices that go into making these, who's in and who's out, how you represent language and so forth, how you talk about events particularly. And I don't propose to talk about those particularly today, though they may come up in questions. I just highlighted on the right here the sort of key information I was keen to capture. They're fairly standard, though they have slight variations around them. What I'm trying to do is, just like any reference prosopography, make this as useful as possible for as many different kinds of people as possible, rather than to look at a specific historical question. And then here's what person data looks like, depending on how you present it. But I want to just focus on three things today in terms of my work, both around what I think I've made material shifts on in that model, and then what that's allowed us to learn about Socrates. So one is around the structure of that factoid, that central piece of information, how we collate the information, how we use it. Secondly is around how we think about quantification and what tool we can use for that. And thirdly is about relationships. And these are not uncommon issues, and I don't think in any case we've got to the bottom of them in prosopography generally. But this is my take on them. So firstly on factoids, and I think this is really about getting location and dating right. So this isn't my diagram, it's John Bradley's diagram, in fact, around how the factoid schema works. So the central argument here is that the factoid, the statement that someone is an emperor, or that these two met in combat, is at the center of the structure, and then you attach to that a whole series of things about person or location or category, and do the source reference. And that's broadly how my database was initially structured, and still is to a degree. There's hangover of this in the database, but I don't think it's quite right, because I think it underplays the importance of location and of date, and that's very visible in the early prosopographies of this, that had location as a kind of piece of information. So you wouldn't record that that so-and-so was a general in a particular place. You would record that they were a general, and then separately you would record that they were in the particular place. And that's evolved so that in most cases now, all pieces of information that are recorded have their location recorded with them. But I think there's still a step beyond that. So actually, when we talk about a factoid, it's really three bits of information that are linked together. It's a statement, someone is a general, in a location. These won't always be possible. That happens at a certain date. And why I think this is important is that it's not always obvious that they will all be automatically the same for every person that engages with them. So you'll often get relationships where someone is a correspondent with another person. They're obviously in different locations. You'll have questions where people are studying works of another, or influenced by their philosophical approach. In my period, it's organism, where date is a problem for the two people who are being cited. And if we don't decompose them, they're very hard to come out, to break out. And you have to do, as I have done, a series of hacks to make sure that you can do the analysis that you want to do. So I just want to show this isn't really just Socrates. This is more general, but what that enables us to do. So this is a piece of work that I talked about in my PhD, but I'm not going to talk about particularly today. Looking at the attestation of all the Eastern bishops during the reign of Theodosius the Great, who's the emperor who establishes Nicene orthodoxy in the late 4th century. And this is obviously requires a certain element of manual analysis, but the first cut of this can be done by effective manipulation of that location information, those statements around individuals and date. But it's possible, it's more accurate because we've decomposed those properly. So this is a list of this is a map of where all the bishops we've heard of during Theodosius's reign. Many of them come from a single source. That's the Council of Constantinople, and they're the ones in blue. Socrates is one of the major sources for most of the red ones, but he's not the only one. And you can tell where they are. Lots of interesting things to say about this, but not today. The second thing I wanted to talk about was around quantitative analysis, and I think there's always a danger. The first caveat you want to say about quantitative analysis is that it's never be used sort of on its own in these contexts. But I do think that digital prosopography, in common with a whole load of digital tools, really allows you to do that quantitative work and very quickly start generating lists of individuals and general sets of people with certain characteristics, and find something to say about them. Obviously, that needs to be caveated by the natures of the sources, and counting isn't the only way we can look at this. But there are two things that I think prosopographies sort of don't do particularly well yet, that would really help that. One of those is implication, and the other is aggregation. So implication is pretty straightforward. In the original Byzantine prosopography, they were very down on implication. Unless it was clearly stated in the source, it didn't go in. And they had explicit examples, so that even if we know the surname of your father and of your son, and they are both the same, if we don't have a concrete attestation of you with that surname, then this individual won't be recorded as that. And that makes lots of purist sense, but it makes it very difficult if you're trying to scoop up all the members of that family and analyze them. It's not specific. It's not sort of universally held. So this status on the left here is from Prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England, published around the same time, and very clearly in that middle paragraph says you can bottom paragraph says you can say, look, it's implied. I'm fairly certain in this case that they can imply the word slave if it's true by ticking a box. They did this for a number of characteristics. I've allowed that for all types of characteristics. And these aren't large numbers. It's about 5 to 10% of my sort of factoid and person links have some element of implication. But it's particularly important for location and dating, because sources are much better at saying it's the Emperor Constantius than they are about saying, oh, we're still in Constantinople. The second part of this is aggregation, and I think this is even more important, if I'm honest. Again, if you faithfully record the source, you'll have different linguistic variations for what are essentially the same thing. And it's really visible when you do what I've done here, which is to show what happens if you search for bishops in the prosopography of the Byzantine world. You come up with 47 individuals. There are a lot more than 47 individuals in the Byzantine world, prosopography of the Byzantine world, who are bishops. But what this is doing is listing those ones who are solely bishops with no other monikers. They might be single people, or they might be plural. And what I've done is simply to add a layer of aggregation. So we'll look if it returns Bishop of Jerusalem or Bishop of Constantinople, give them all the category of bishop. And there are some particularly linguistic oddities in Socrates that make that very useful. So a large number, about 10% of those bishops aren't referred to as bishops. They're referred to as presiding over their churches. We know they're bishops in almost all cases, but you'd miss them if you were just searching for bishops. Of course, you want to do a linguistic search, that's still available. And so I wanted to just show a bit of quantitative analysis on Socrates to show us where this matters and how getting this right can help. So I won't labour all the items here. One of the one of the things I do want to show just is a question of scale. So Socrates is a big source, I said earlier. It's about a fifth in size of in terms of the sort of information captured compared to the first editions of those prosopographies in 2005 and 2006. You get about 11,500 factoid person pairs, i.e. an information set about a person, comprised of about 1,500 persons, and about 6,500 bits of information. Socrates is, and then here's what quantitative analysis I think can sort of point you in the wall. Some of these are obvious, so it's hard to do much without comparisons, but you can tell that this is a narrative history. There's a lot of narrative material in there. Interested in relationships, that's partly because of the way I've structured this and how it's talked about. But for an ecclesiastical history, it sure does talk about emperors a lot. And we'll talk about that a bit more when we talk about relationships. But the three biggest and most documented figures in Socrates are Constantine, son Constantius II, and Bishop Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria. The Emperor Julian is fourth. The really interesting thing where quantitative analysis I think gets most useful is around offices and religion. So I've just shown the sort of numbers here around where the offices are. So that's one of the categories I use to talk about what kind of dignity or office people hold. It's almost all ecclesiastical, and let's be honest, it's really all episcopal. This isn't really an ecclesiastical history, it's really a history of bishops. So 2/3 of the recorded sort of individuals with office data are ecclesiastics, 3/4 of them are bishops. There's very little for the junior ecclesiastical hierarchy. There's a handful of monks, and I did a quick comparison with some sets of another ecclesiastical history of this period, that's the Sozerman. You get quite a lot more monks, though you still got a lot of bishops. But the civil hierarchy is almost entirely absent. So aside from emperors, you have a very small set of individuals who are in the civil hierarchy. Same is true for the military. There's a handful of generals, mostly sort of crushing heresy. Though you do get the occasional war being recorded. And the one thing I want to do to show really how aggregation really changes the story is when I look at religion factoids. So religion is the most hard to record in my data because it tends to be the most poetically recorded. And what I've done in aggregation is to summarize some of those religious positions. And there are two big things here around the 4th century, two big parties around Nicene orthodoxy and or the homoousios position and Arianism, as described as Socrates. I've aggregated in both cases over 30 terms that refer to each of those to produce the graph like this. And some of those are pretty straightforward. They're just slightly different language. Other those are highly context specific. And so that's the power of aggregation. Because I think the pattern that it shows is this over the period Socrates is talking about fading away of religious conflict. So books 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all in the 4th century before Theodosius the Great establishes an agreed orthodox position. And you can see this ramping up of sort of religious party variants. Book 3 is Julian the Apostate's reign, and the book 4 broadly reigns. And you don't get much in the way of Nicene versus Arian controversy. You get a bit more about Christians and others. And then from book 5 onwards, it fades away. General talk about religion fades away. There's a little bump up in book 7. That's novations, who are a particular set that Socrates was very interested in. And what's interesting about novations and about aggregation is that everyone has always talked about Socrates' interest in novations. There are 49 individuals that are recorded as novations in his work. But there are 35 individuals that are recorded as Macedonians, so it's a little bit less, but it's much more evenly distributed. Macedonians are a heretic sect that deny the co-divinity of the Holy Spirit, no one really talks about Socrates' treatment of the Macedonians. And it's only by doing this analysis that it pops up as a potential area of interest. The last thing I want to talk about is, relationships. And I think this is something that is ever more fashionable when we talk to prosopography. I remember 10 years ago at this very seminar, listening to Tim Hill talk about the potential for relationships, and I'm very glad I did, because it allowed me to do this work. Others, like the people of medieval Scotland, have done some really fascinating things with their information as well. It's really striking how little there is on relationships in traditional prosopography, and that's true even for the first factoid prosopographies 15 years ago. In fact, it's striking how little there is on types of relationship at all. So when I thought about doing this, I was hoping that somewhere in the sociology section of the library there would be a taxonomy of types of relationship and how you might construct those. And if there is, I didn't find it. So what you have is my untrained sense of what are the interesting relationships to track. The boxes on the left are the big categories that I think are most interesting for Socrates, at least. I think they have some. I would argue they have some general application, and that's kinship, which people have always been interested in. Hierarchical relationships. So I've listed the big examples on the right for all of these. Superior, subordinate, sort of formal ones, but also informal ones, and teacher-pupil, which is a big deal in some of the ecclesiastical and doctrinal debates. And these ones that really come up in the Scottish prosopography, because almost all their evidence is charters, so you get an awful lot of employment relationships or seigneurial relationships in there. But I think there's some others as well that crop up in narrative sources, horizontal relationships, both hostile and allied in various kinds, ideological relationships, which in my source is all doctrinal. Are you in communion or out of communion? They have quite technical usages in the language. And then what I've called transformational relationships, where people change the status of another. Some of these are obviously very specific to the late antique religious context. Nowhere else do you have emperors constantly summoning councils. But I think it's a really important dynamic that would be good to capture. But in every way, you will get appointment. And so I've used that to build a much richer sense of the relationships that are documented in Socrates. And I think particularly to try and understand a couple of things around Socrates, around the role of the emperor and the extent to which Socrates is talking about a coherent set of people, or essentially a loose set of stories about the church. Because certainly in Eusebius's history, you get quite a lot of. And here is another interesting story that I've got to tell you. I always like to show this picture when I talk about network analysis, which is essentially what I've done with that data. This is my favorite bit of modern network analysis about 10 years ago, where they analyzed all the phone calls, landlines people made. And I particularly like it because my Welsh wife is horrified at the sort of disintegration of Wales as an entity. But it's really noteworthy. I don't have anything like that, those ideal conditions. It's relatively small amounts of data. They're not uniform. This is all 12 billion phone records. So it's much smaller than that, obviously. But it's not just phone records. It's me structuring some untidy data, and it's obviously partial. But I think we can make a study of Socrates and what he does in his presentation. And it looks like this. So I never quite managed to get the numbers and to replace them with names, but I've put a little key on the left. So the blue is our bishops, and blue lines are bishop to bishop relationships, and pink is secular, and obviously the grey lines are when you're doing secular to bishops. And it's really striking that both those debates that are not less obvious when you read the text become quite striking when you crunch the numbers on it. So this is book 5, the reign of Theodosius the Great. There are about 150 individuals cited in that. 115 are part of this network. They don't all radiate out from a single figure. They are linked in lots of different chains. And most of the rest are sort of out of period individuals. So their names are there, but they're not in the reign of Theodosius the Great. And the second thing is we talked about was just how the interesting thing about who is important. So looking at this, and backing it up with the numbers, I think you can see some fairly clear trends. So one is the centrality of the emperor. So Emperor Theodosius is number 494. That's bang in the middle, stretching out both to secular individuals and to religious. And he's overwhelmingly the most linked to persons. So 47 other individuals he has a relationship with. No one else comes close to that, and that's true both of the ecclesiastical and civil hierarchy. And if you look at other emperors, that's less pronounced. So his grandson Theodosius II is much weaker as an emperor, and you can see that in the social graph. But you can also see that clustering of religious figures. So that dense network of key players in the establishment of sort of Christian Nicene orthodoxy are all there, clustered in that box, and they are quite specific. There's one exception, which is Lucius of Cyzicus, but the others are all key players in the establishment of orthodoxy. And big players otherwise are relegated to the fringes. So on the far right is Gregory of Nazianzus, not part of Socrates' story, in Book 5, and somewhere else lurks Ambrose of Milan as well. And the really interesting thing about these would be if we could do them for everyone. So this is Socrates. I'd love to do these for others and to compare those social graphs. And that's sort of what I'm working on now, is to build the same thing for Sozomen, who's a parallel ecclesiastical historian, and for Theodorus of Cyrus to do the same for him. And I think I'm going to end sort of on that point. But I think there's some real valuable, interesting things we can do from these single source prosopographies, and I think they may well be a route to filling in the gaps of late antique prosopography. But the real value will come when we have more of these to play with, more comparisons to make, more linking to do, hopefully with fairly consistent approaches and ways in which we can both compare and contrast those sources, but also link them up to form a more complete picture. That's a social network that's presented in Socrates. It would be obviously far more, at least as interesting, to look at what a wider and more accurate picture would look like. But for that, several other people have got to do several other very long projects to access all the data. So I think, Gabby, you can switch this back on.
That was a fascinating and very thorough overview of digital prosopography, late antiquity for those of us who come from other aspects of antiquity, and of your work in particular. I think that was a very useful summary. Even though I have seen your work before, it was. I found that very valuable. In terms of discussion, questions, just a reminder to people watching this live that you may ask questions in the live chat, and we will see those, and we'll attempt to address them. But while we're waiting for any questions to come up there, does anyone in the call want to ask anything? I can start off with a question that probably won't surprise you, as you know that my interest in prosopography is largely in terms of how one captures this sort of information as linked open data. I was wondering if either in your work or in the other factoid prosopographies that you've looked at and are talking about, there's been you made much attempt to normalize things like places, dates, and even names to external authorities of one kind or another.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real problem place is probably the best there's greater authority on places of Pleiades and so forth. But I think it's still a long way off. I did it mine, so there's I mean, I haven't done the technical side, but the data's there, so all my places are recognizable as entities on that. I think on names, it is painstakingly slow. I mean, you know this far better than I do with Snap, but it's painstakingly slow. I'm really struck by just the basic level of inconsistency within projects. So indexes are not consistent from volume to volume of published material, and so forth. So I did some concordance work where they appear elsewhere. I've done all the concordance against the big prosopographies, but I haven't done a lot on that standardization. I think it's absolutely right that on all those three things, on place and name and date, which is definitely under thought through, is sort of a big gap on how we think about it, and I don't quite know exactly how you would do it, sort of as an independent project. I think it is where that sort of basic science element of big institutions sort of comes to play, so I struggled a bit to think about what would be the most useful thing I could do. So I linked to some big published stuff, hoping that it would get scooped up when someone did the proper concordances. But it's not just in prosopography. The thing that really struck me is that it would be brilliant if published material used this. There is nothing to stop the people writing books using exactly the same entities, because then they'd just be easier to find, and that clearly doesn't happen. PLRE2, for example, does not give the same numbers to the people who appear in PLRE1, which I found extraordinary.
Right. But you used, for example, Pleiades or other gazetteer identifiers for places in your database.
Yes, absolutely. So there's my location table has all those. For simplicity, I sucked in all the reference, all the geocode data from Pleiades, but it does have all the same IDs. Exactly. And you need to do that at the source level because of disambiguation. So you need at the source to be able to go, it's this place, it's not that place, even though they are bewilderingly overlapping.
Okay, we now have a few questions in the chat. Does anyone else in the call want to ask anything in the meantime?
I do have some questions in the live. Yes. Yeah, they're ready.
Yeah. Okay, let's grab one or two questions from live. A fairly quick question, I suspect, from Maton Ribari. Do you record factoids manually, or are there aspects which you were able to automate?
I would love there to have been automation, and I suspect smarter programmers than I could do something clever. In fact, I know they can. I know they can around even just spotting where names are and zooming in on this. So I did it all painstakingly manually. I mean, I had obviously the text of Socrates from TLG that I could cut and paste, but very little other than that. I mean, I think one of the difficulties is that you can do a certain amount of scraping automatically. One could around identifying names and obvious keywords that you can start to populate. The bulk of it, I think, would still be manual, partly because those dates are heavy on interpretation, as is location, or not interpretation, but finding them. Usually in Socrates, it's the end of a chapter. They'll give you a set of consuls and dates. So I did it all manually. I suspect there's some automation, but I think it would help, but not transform the task of how you would do this.
Yeah, well, and there's a very related question.
Yeah, so definition of factoids. I mean, I think this is always contentious. I think some are very clear. we talked about offices, titles, occupations. Yeah, I think the things that are more defined are more automatable. So find me all the emperors, or all the times you see emperor, and that's always attached to a name. Though that's not without translation issues, but with some of the others, it becomes, I don't think it's expert discretion. I think it's around, in most cases, close reading. Any expertise, I think, isn't really about the sort of method, but more about the about knowledge of the text. So to know, I talk about those bishops who aren't referred to as bishops; they're just referred to as presiding over their churches, be that the location, presiding over the church in Alexandria, or a sect presiding over the novations. You need to know what they're talking about. Where it gets most tricky is, I think, when events happen. So in everything else, you are literally cutting snippets of text. But with events, I mean, you can do that, but it becomes very cumbersome very quickly. That's when you need to summarize. And that's true for all prosopographies. You have to summarize, this is the bit where X is defeated by Y, or there's a large council. You don't need for prosopography, you don't want the narrative, you just need to know it happened, so that you can make those links and do that record.
Broke in the middle of that, but I hope everyone else caught everything. So from the chat, this question from Hope Willard. I'm curious about.
Yeah, so transformational relationships. I mean, yeah, I'm glad you stressed it was my taxonomy. Smarter people than I may think about this differently. I think there is something about performing an act that makes you beholden to, that changes status, that is distinct from a hierarchical one. So particularly in the vertical hierarchies we talked about. So generals and their soldiers, bishops and their priests, patriarchs and their bishops, though yes, has issues in this period. I think they overlap, but they're not the same as transformation. And again, I haven't really used that functionality. I didn't have a particular usage in mind to be able to say, oh, let me look at who was appointed or consecrated bishops. In this case, it would be. But I can see how someone might want to say, yes, the bishops of the area, for example, coming together to consecrate an individual, but they're not his superior, and the sort of metropolitan of the province would be, but they're not his superior. So I think there was something distinct around those. And baptism is another key one. The emperors get baptized; they're certainly no one's subordinate. So I think they are distinct. I think it would be interesting, and I've not done it actually, to look to see to what extent they do overlap, to what extent we have evidence for transformation of people who have vertical relationships as well. That's yes, something I've not done, but I think it's different.
Great. Sorry, my connection's slow, so I'm a little delayed on the transition between questions and so forth. Anybody in the group to interrupt? If you want to jump in with a question, I'm going to skip to a couple more of the questions from YouTube. So Charlotte Rouchet, known to you, I believe.
Indeed.
Asks, is one lesson kind of emphasis really important for understanding the historiography?
And I think that's clearly right. Charlotte obviously knows this very well. As one of my co-supervisors on this, and she's absolutely right. I think this is why it is worth doing these, particularly for highly authored accounts. That analysis of Socrates tells you about the historiography. I would love, and hopefully will have at a later date, the comparisons. So I mentioned Sosman, who takes Socrates' material and perhaps some other bits and rewrites it. Becomes really interesting for comparing. When historiography becomes really interesting for comparing. So although Socrates has written a very authored account, he's jumbled his sources to make his points, and so forth. He is, to a certain degree, at the mercy of the sources he has. So these are clearly of insight for historiography. You can't rely on them too much elsewhere. That network of bishops and emperors may well reflect Socrates' own desired presentation. We know all these ecclesiastical histories are written in the shadow of an emperor who was keen to project that dynastic and religious unity that makes that such presentation would reflect. So I say, but for me, comparisons would be the thing that really unlocks that. Takes it to another level. So what we've got is interesting in its own right, but I'd say I'd love to do a comparison for the historiographical elements. So just, I think I hear Gabby talking, but I think the delay may be too great. So yeah, it's worth dwelling on persons a bit, actually. I'm conscious of skipping over that. The sort of prosopography has persons with a capitalized P, which isn't actually people. It's individuals in all cases. So about 2/3 of the persons in my database are individuals. The remainder are groups of people. And there's two, for me, some of those are defined groups, i.e. the Tall Brothers, a set of monks from Egypt, and it's important to capture those together. And then some are broader entities like the inhabitants of Alexandria. What do we know about them? When I talk about factoid person, I may have slipped up here, but I try to talk about factoid person pairs. So if we imagine that list of information that is factoids and that list of information that is that are persons, not always individuals, what you have is pairs of data. So it's not always one-to-one, but that's the unit of information that's most interesting to say. Person so-and-so has factoid X associated with them. Constantine has factoid that he's the emperor, that he is a Nicene attached to them. So so the factoid person is the person with the factoid information attached to them, and that's really the currency of all the quantification you can do on this, and it's why I think that disambiguation of the elements within the factoid are critical, because they do vary. They're not always unitary. And I can see Charlotte's second point popping up here around the authored nature of the authored nature of some of this, and I think that's exactly right. I think, and again, as with all this, we can dream of the moment where everyone has done this for every source. So we know that Socrates makes great use of Athanasius' writings for a chunk of the mid 4th century. People have done this. It's not this isn't a new question, but it would be very interesting to get new analysis on it. Say if you did have this, what is the quantified nature of those things?
Okay. Can you all hear? Talk?
A bit.
Yes. Okay. Then I'm partly because my network is a bit problematic. I'm not confident that if I ask any further questions, they'll be very clear, and also because Will and I have discussed this before. Again, probably don't need to on here. There is one more question in the chat. If we don't mind going on a little bit longer, from Matt.
Yeah, so this I think is great strength of factoid prosopography generally, and it's a vexed question of what to do with it. So factoid prosopography tries not to judge on this, merely to compile the information. So if you're looking up the entries, less true. I mean, it has a slightly different, I think, tone in a single source prosopography, but you're looking at this returns all the facts or factoids about Julian, for example, which will be polemical in many cases in Socrates. They'll go in. Same with people that don't exist. And yes, there are some problematic locations, but mostly it's people and events. I think there's a few things to say on this. So one, in a sort of broader factual prosopography that becomes quite interesting, I think it is a vexed question without any editorializing at all, which none of these prosopographies have. It's very hard for a non-specialist to kind of pick up the bit that, oh, well, this bit generally is not believed to be true. But I think it's a price to pay. I think the interesting thing in mine I find is that some is quite how to treat things where you know they're not true. So there's a misidentification of a bishop called a George. There are two bishops called George, who are bishops of Alexandria for different parties, and the narrative starts off clearly misidentifying it, and at some point it stops being an explicit identification, and I do switch the identification back to the one we know it is. But yeah, those false facts are in there. Those false dates are in there, where people assert things happen on a day where we know they don't, because relevant emperors have died. So something is wrong with it. But the important thing, I think, is to record what the source says, so that people can do that analysis. And there will undoubtedly be flourishes. Socrates, Sozomen's account, for example, has more stuff in than Socrates, and it's very obvious in some cases that's not reliable. I don't know if we still have Gabby, who may be essential to this. So I'll just pick up Jun's second point around the developing the factoid model further. I mean, I think there's lots to be done. One question is, I think, getting consistency around how we do this. So I think John Bradley will probably talk about this as well when he does it. He's done some work on trying to define that ontology, and that's been being refined, for at least 15 years around how we do this. I think there's a second question just around usage and getting consistency of sort of how we treat the information. So that broad structure, yes, people have tweaked it and changed it and so forth, and I think that will continue. But I think where it becomes, the big shift in my work wasn't introducing some weird new concept. It was around how much attention do you pay to certain information. So this hugely more relationship information that I captured, not because relationships weren't a thing in early prosopographies, but because people just weren't looking for them very hard. So I think about prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England had non-kin relationships, but I think it's about, that prosopography has about 16,000 more people in, but only about 3 times more relationships in. There's bound to be stuff we can do on the structure and refining and tightening that up. But I think it's much more around the material and how we get better at consistency. And I'm totally guilty of not being helpful on this by doing an individual element of this. But it's how we start drawing those together so that you can do more interesting analysis with these, or at least enable automation that can means that with limited work you can do some interesting linkage. Gabby, you're back. I don't know if anyone on the call wants to ask any questions.
My network is still almost intolerable. I might actually ask Valeria to take over chairing the last part of this, because I'm not sure I'm here.
I'd be happy to. I'll try to rejoin as as a host, I'm not sure that's going to happen, but I'll try.
Oh, I don't know what happened to Valeria there.
Maybe coming back to host. I mean,
I was.
we may be coming to the end.
Take over. Yeah. No, I was. I think probably all that remains. We've got to the end in terms of time. I hope you can hear me slightly. Is just this is the point at which normally the room would explode into applause and breaking out some bottles of wine. So apologies that we can't do either of those things. We'll make it up to you sometime once we're able to be physically in the same space again at some point in the future. But thank you very much again for this this presentation, Will, and thank you all of the audience on YouTube for your questions and participation. And see you all next week when it will be, I believe, Martin Ribéry and Barbara McGillivray talking about, I don't have the title up in front of me, but talking about extracting terminology of the Roman law of ownership from Justinian's Digest. So please come along next week. Thanks again. Bye.